The air in Chicago carried a chill that never seemed to leave, even on summer nights when laughter echoed from speakeasies and the glow of hidden clubs painted secret light across alleys. In the quiet hours, when the city's hum softened and the river reflected broken stars, a man walked with a steady pace, his hat pulled low, his coat collar turned high. He was not the loudest voice in any room, not the kind of man who drew attention with flair or showmanship, but those who knew whispered his name in careful tones. That name was Frank, and though the city called him many things, the one that clung most firmly was a word meant to carry weight: enforcer. But before he was that man, before his name carried shadows, he was simply a boy growing up in the streets of Italy, where sun-warmed stone walls and narrow passageways taught lessons different from those he would later learn in Chicago. His family brought him to America when he was still young, carrying hope like a fragile flame in the darkness of uncertainty. They came searching for opportunity, for the promise of a better life in a land that spoke with energy and chance. Yet the streets of Chicago did not hand out promises freely. They demanded grit, quick thinking, and an ability to adapt. For a boy like Frank, small but sharp, every day was a lesson in survival. He was not drawn to school. The classrooms felt confining, the lessons distant from the struggles his family faced. His education came instead from alleys and street corners, from watching men barter favors and protect territories with silent gestures and quick nods. He studied people the way others studied books. He learned to measure character in the cut of a glance, the weight of a pause, the firmness of a handshake. By the time he was a teenager, Frank already moved with the awareness of someone older, someone who had decided that survival was not enough. He wanted to shape the world around him. The early years of the century were not gentle in Chicago. The city was alive with ambition, but riddled with hardship. Immigrant families crowded into tenements. Work was scarce, and opportunities were scarce unless you created them. Frank watched older boys drift into gangs, carrying themselves with confidence that seemed untouchable. They had suits when others had patched jackets. They had money when others scraped for coins. It was not the glamour that appealed to him, but the power. The way they made decisions while others waited for decisions to be made for them. Frank had no intention of waiting. As Prohibition cast its shadow across the country, Chicago transformed into a city of opportunity for men willing to bend rules. Where the law closed doors, others opened hidden ones. Behind unmarked entrances, in basements and back rooms, liquor flowed, music played, and money exchanged hands in stacks that most men could only dream of. Frank slipped into this world quietly, not with the reckless eagerness of those chasing quick fortune, but with the calm determination of someone who understood that patience was its own form of power. He began small, as many did, running errands, guarding doors, watching over shipments. He earned his place not by boasting, but by delivering, every time, without error. Older men noticed his steadiness, his refusal to panic when things grew tense. Where others grew loud, Frank remained calm. Where others hesitated, he acted decisively. Slowly, he built a reputation that traveled further than the narrow blocks of his neighborhood. His name reached men who commanded not just streets, but entire operations, men who sought reliability above all else. Among those men was one whose name would dominate the city, Al Capone. Where Capone brought charisma and spectacle, Frank provided something quieter but just as essential: discipline. The two men were different in many ways, yet their partnership worked because Frank never sought the spotlight. He preferred the background, the silent presence that reminded others of consequence without ever needing to speak it aloud. In that silence, his influence grew. Frank's life became a balance of shadows and loyalty. He was not a man of endless words or theatrical gestures. He was measured, precise, and reliable, the kind of man who could sit in a room and speak only once yet leave everyone certain of his meaning. To those who knew him, this was his true power, the ability to carry weight without demanding it. And in a city where noise often drew dangerous eyes, Frank's quiet strength kept him alive and rising. At home, he lived simply, never flaunting wealth the way others did. His family saw in him a man of steadiness, someone who provided without exposing them to the turbulence of his world. He carried his dual life with care, never allowing one side to bleed too deeply into the other. It was this discipline, this ability to separate the personal from the professional, that gave him an edge in a life where mistakes often blurred lines too carelessly. By the time the city fully recognized his presence, Frank was no longer just an associate moving in the shadows. He was a figure tied directly to the operations that defined Chicago's underworld. His reputation traveled not through headlines but through whispers, through the caution of men who spoke his name with a mixture of respect and unease. He had become the quiet force behind louder men, the steady foundation on which more flamboyant figures built their empires. But even as he rose, Frank remained acutely aware of the dangers around him. He knew that power invited envy, that success drew attention, that every step forward carried the weight of greater risks. He lived with vigilance, never mistaking respect for safety. And though the world saw in him a man of control, he carried within him the constant knowledge that control could slip in an instant. The boy from Italy who once walked narrow alleys had become a man whose presence shaped the rhythm of Chicago nights. His journey had just begun, and though he could not yet see its full arc, he knew that he had stepped into a life that would test him in ways greater than any classroom ever could. The city was watching, waiting, and Frank Nitti was ready to leave his mark. Not with noise, but with the quiet certainty of a man who understood that true power did not shout. It whispered. The rhythm of Chicago in the 1920s was unlike anywhere else. Jazz poured out of hidden clubs, laughter mingled with the clink of glasses filled with liquor that was not supposed to exist, and every night the city seemed alive with contradictions. Joy shadowed by danger, wealth balanced on risk. Frank moved through this world not as a spectator, but as one of the unseen architects, a man whose steadiness allowed others to shine while he worked quietly in the background. His role was not to entertain or charm, but to ensure the machinery kept running, to make certain that shipments moved, payments arrived, and silence was kept where silence was needed most. The man at the center of it all, Al Capone, commanded attention like no other. His charisma drew people to him, his temper sent them scrambling, and his ambition fueled an empire that reached across Chicago. But even Capone needed men who could carry out the endless details of that empire, men who could balance chaos with order. Frank Nitti became one of those men, and more than that, he became essential. Where Capone's fire burned brightly, Frank's steadiness kept the flame from consuming everything. He was often described as quiet, and it was true. He did not boast, he did not seek headlines, he did not court unnecessary attention. But his silence was not weakness, it was control. When Frank entered a room, people felt it. He did not need to raise his voice. The weight of his presence spoke for him. If he asked a question, it was precise. If he gave an instruction, it was followed. This calm authority earned him a reputation among the men who worked under Capone. They knew he was not prone to rash decisions, that he thought before he acted, that his judgment could be trusted. In an age when many sought power by being louder, bolder, more reckless, Frank carved his place by being the opposite. He was the man who could step into chaos and bring it to order. He was the one who reminded others that strength was not always in how loudly one shouted, but in how firmly one stood. And because of this, Capone leaned on him more and more. The operations of the outfit were vast. Prohibition had created a demand so enormous that the profits seemed endless, but endless profits brought endless complications. Shipments from Canada had to be managed carefully, guarded against hijackers and rival outfits. Speakeasies spread across the city like veins, each requiring oversight, each needing supplies, protection, and discretion. Politicians and police officers had to be handled, some with money, others with subtle reminders of the influence they faced. It was a web so intricate that a single weak thread could unravel the whole. Frank became one of the men who ensured those threads held firm. One winter night, as snow fell thick and heavy across Chicago, Frank sat in the back of a dimly lit office where accounts were being tallied. Men shuffled papers, counted stacks of bills, argued over discrepancies. Tension filled the room, voices rising with frustration. Frank, seated in the corner with his hat tilted low, listened in silence. When the argument threatened to break into shouting, he raised his head, spoke a few measured words, and the room stilled. His instruction was clear, his tone calm, and the matter was resolved with efficiency. That night, the men left with no doubt about who held the real authority in that room, even if his name never appeared in the papers. At home, Frank continued to live with a kind of simplicity that belied his position. He did not parade wealth before neighbors, did not draw suspicion with excess. He understood that the louder a man lived, the shorter his future might be. His home was steady, his habits disciplined. This ability to separate his personal life from the world of the outfit gave him a balance that many lacked. He could walk the streets with his family as an ordinary man, then slip into meetings where decisions shaped the city's underworld. The two sides of his life rarely crossed, and that separation helped him endure in a world that consumed many too quickly. The city itself became a canvas on which Frank's quiet influence was painted. Clubs thrived, shipments flowed, alliances held. But as the outfit grew, so too did the challenges. Rivals circled constantly, hungry for a share of the immense profits. Law enforcement, though often compromised, still pressed closer, building cases, watching movements, gathering names. For Capone, these pressures often led to fiery confrontations. For Frank, they were puzzles to be solved. He approached problems like an architect, breaking them down into parts, addressing each with calm precision. Where others saw threats, he saw patterns, and his ability to read those patterns made him invaluable. In moments of crisis, his calmness became even more evident. One evening, a shipment had been intercepted, tensions ran high, and voices around the table demanded retaliation. Capone, furious, paced the room, ready to order swift and reckless action. Frank, seated quietly, spoke only once, suggesting patience and redirection instead of fury. His reasoning was clear, his tone unwavering, and though it was difficult, Capone listened. The response was delayed, more calculated, and ultimately more effective than an immediate reaction would have been. It was in these moments that Frank proved himself not just a follower, but a strategist. By the late 1920s, Frank Nitti was no longer just one of many men in Capone's circle. He had become one of the pillars of the outfit, the man others looked to when uncertainty clouded the path ahead. His name might not have been emblazoned in headlines as often as Capone's, but within the organization, his influence was undeniable. He had carved his legacy not through noise, but through steadiness, not through recklessness, but through control. The city outside glittered with music and laughter, but beneath the surface it pulsed with the tension of rivalries, ambition, and law enforcement tightening its net. Frank understood that this balance could not last forever, that every empire faced its reckoning. But for now, the outfit stood strong, and his role within it was secure. The boy who had once wandered the streets of Chicago, watching others seize power, was now one of the men shaping that power from the inside. And though he knew the dangers, he also knew there was no turning back. He had chosen his path, and he would walk it with the same calm certainty that had carried him this far. The 1930s dawned with a shift in the air, a heaviness that hung over Chicago like smoke that refused to clear. Prohibition was still the law of the land, and speakeasies still pulsed with jazz and liquor behind closed doors. But the mood had changed. What once felt like endless opportunity now carried the sharp edge of consequence. Federal agents had grown bolder, newspapers louder, and rivals more desperate. In this climate, the outfit needed men who could steady the ship, men who could balance fire with calm. Frank Nitti became that man more than ever. Al Capone still commanded the headlines, his name printed in bold across front pages, his every move followed with fascination. To the public he was larger than life, a symbol of both defiance and danger. But to those inside the world of the outfit, it was increasingly clear that the weight of attention was dangerous. Capone's charisma had built the empire, but that same charisma now drew relentless pursuit. The government wanted him, the press sensationalized him, and every rival hoped to see him fall. In this storm, Frank's quiet steadiness became essential. He was the counterbalance, the one who kept the machinery turning while the spotlight blinded others. Frank's responsibilities deepened as pressure mounted. He ensured shipments moved with precision, accounts were balanced, and relationships with political figures and police contacts remained intact. He was the man who handled the details others overlooked, the one who kept the outfit's foundations from cracking even as Capone's public battles consumed attention. He preferred it that way. While others chased the thrill of headlines, Frank thrived in the silence of back rooms where real power was sustained. It was not that Frank lacked ambition. He simply understood ambition differently. He knew that noise invited scrutiny, and scrutiny was fatal in their world. He pursued influence quietly, building strength not in displays but in consistency. Men trusted him because he never wavered, never allowed emotion to cloud judgment, never made promises he couldn't keep. That reliability became his greatest weapon. One evening, as Capone faced growing legal troubles, Frank met with a small group of trusted men in a quiet apartment away from prying eyes. They spoke in low voices about the future, about what would happen if Capone's battles with the law reached their inevitable conclusion. Frank did not panic, did not speculate wildly. He laid out the facts, the realities of what they faced, and the adjustments that would be required. His tone was calm, his words measured, and by the time the meeting ended, the men left with a sense of direction. In uncertain times, Frank's steadiness was a lighthouse. The government's pursuit of Capone grew relentless. Taxes, a word once dismissed as trivial, became the weapon that finally cornered him. While Capone fought legal battles that drained his energy and focus, Frank quietly ensured the outfit did not collapse. Shipments continued, money flowed, and alliances held, because Frank refused to allow cracks to widen. To the outside world, Capone's empire seemed tied solely to the man himself, but within the organization, everyone knew it was Frank's hands that kept the gears turning. At home, Frank carried himself as he always had, simple, steady, careful. Neighbors knew him as a man of discipline, someone who lived with quiet dignity. He never paraded wealth, never drew unnecessary attention. This separation of personal life from professional storms remained his greatest shield. Even as the city buzzed with rumors and headlines, Frank walked his own neighborhood with the same measured step he had since youth. His world was dangerous, but he did not allow danger to define his home. When Capone was finally convicted and sent away, the shock reverberated across Chicago. The city buzzed with the news, papers printed bold headlines, and the government celebrated its victory. For many, it seemed the empire had fallen. But inside the outfit, Frank stepped forward. He did not seize the spotlight or proclaim himself leader. That was never his style. Instead, he simply continued what he had always done, kept the machinery running, ensured the flow of money, protected alliances, and reminded everyone that the outfit was larger than any one man, even Capone. His leadership was quiet but undeniable. Men deferred to him not because he demanded it, but because his calm steadiness commanded trust. He became the figure others turned to in moments of doubt, the one who could cut through fear with a single measured statement. Rivals soon learned that though Capone was gone, the outfit was not weakened. If anything, under Frank's careful hand, it grew more stable. The city outside shifted as the depression deepened. Bread lines stretched along sidewalks, families struggled, and desperation touched every corner. Yet in this hardship, the outfit continued to thrive. Where legitimate businesses faltered, their hidden economy thrived, and Frank ensured it did so with precision. He adapted to the changing times, finding ways to weave the outfit's influence into new opportunities while holding firm to the foundations that had carried them through Prohibition. Still, the dangers never vanished. Law enforcement remained watchful. Rivals circled constantly, and within the outfit itself, ambition simmered. Frank managed it all with the same quiet discipline he always had. He was not blind to threats, but he did not waste energy on panic. He read people carefully, adjusted strategies subtly, and maintained the balance that kept the empire intact. There were moments when younger men, eager for power, questioned his calmness, mistaking it for hesitation. But when they acted rashly and brought trouble, it was Frank who stepped in to repair the damage. Over time, even the most restless learned that his way was the path of survival. In a world where recklessness destroyed men quickly, Frank's patience proved stronger than any weapon. By the mid-1930s, Frank Nitti was no longer just the quiet enforcer who supported Capone's empire. He had become the central figure guiding it. His name still did not dominate headlines the way Capone's had, but within Chicago's underworld, his authority was unquestioned. He was the man who ensured continuity, who steadied the ship through storms, who reminded everyone that true power did not come from noise, but from control. And yet, even as he carried the outfit forward, Frank understood the cost. Power was never without weight, and every decision carried consequences. He had risen from a boy in Italy to one of the most powerful figures in Chicago, but he never allowed himself to forget how fragile it all was. He knew that the city was always watching, that rivals were always plotting, and that even the strongest men could fall. His strength was not in believing himself untouchable, but in never forgetting that he wasn't. The city continued to hum with music, laughter, and shadows. Behind the curtains of speakeasies and in the quiet back rooms of restaurants, Frank's presence was felt in every decision, every deal, every dollar. He had become the quiet architect of Chicago's underworld, a man who carried power without needing to shout. And as the years pressed on, he would need every ounce of that steadiness, for storms still lingered on the horizon. The city had changed by the mid-1930s. The glitter of prohibition nights had dulled. The jazz still played, but now behind doors that felt less secret, less daring. The economy had collapsed into despair. Bread lines stretched down streets once filled with laughter, and ordinary people carried exhaustion in their faces. Yet in that same city, where businesses failed and families struggled, the outfit endured. Its operations had adapted, slipping into new ventures, weaving themselves into the very fabric of Chicago life. At the center of that quiet machine stood Frank Nitti. Capone was gone, locked away in a cell where headlines could no longer follow him, and the man who once drew all eyes now lived out his years in silence. For the outfit, this could have been the end. Many believed it would collapse without Capone's charisma, that the empire built on his larger-than-life persona could not stand without its figurehead. But they underestimated the strength of what had been built beneath the surface, and they underestimated the man who had been there all along. Steady, patient, deliberate. Frank had never sought the spotlight, and that was precisely why he thrived now. His leadership was unlike Capone's in every way. Where Capone's voice filled a room, Frank's steadiness quieted it. Where Capone chased spectacle, Frank avoided it. He understood that the age of flamboyant rule was over. The government had made an example of Capone, and anyone who tried to follow that same path would meet the same fate. Instead, Frank chose to lead with subtlety. He trimmed excess, avoided unnecessary attention, and focused on efficiency. To him, survival mattered more than spectacle. The outfit's income streams diversified under his watch. Prohibition still lingered in the early years, but as its end approached, Frank prepared for the shift. He guided the family into labor racketeering, gambling, and construction. He understood that alcohol could not be the only foundation forever. They needed roots in places that would remain profitable no matter how the laws shifted. He was not a gambler by nature, not reckless, but a strategist who built carefully, ensuring stability in uncertain times. Inside the outfit, challenges still surfaced. Ambition never slept, and men who had tasted power during the Capone years sometimes tested Frank's quiet control. Younger figures, eager to prove themselves, occasionally mistook his silence for weakness. They spoke louder in meetings, made rash decisions, or tried to push their influence further than it reached. Frank never raised his voice in response. He simply waited, watched, and when the moment came, corrected their course with precision. Those who underestimated him quickly learned that silence was not absence, it was strength. One evening, in a smoky back room where the air smelled of tobacco and tension, a disagreement erupted over territory. A younger man pressed hard, challenging Frank in front of others, his words sharp, his tone disrespectful. The room bristled with unease, waiting for fireworks. Frank sat quietly, listening, letting the younger man exhaust himself. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, calm, unshakable. He did not shout, did not threaten. He simply explained the reality of the situation, the balance that had to be maintained, and the consequences of ignoring it. The room fell silent. The younger man lowered his eyes, and the matter ended without further noise. Those present understood more clearly than ever that Frank Nitti's power did not come from volume. It came from unmovable control. The Depression years were harsh on the city, but for the outfit they offered opportunities. With businesses failing, unions grew restless, and desperate men looked for work wherever they could find it. Frank saw in this not chaos but structure waiting to be organized. The outfit's reach into labor grew deeper, influence spreading through strikes, negotiations, and contracts. It was not glamorous work, not the kind that drew headlines, but it was stable, lucrative, and far less conspicuous than Prohibition's noisy liquor trade. Under Frank's guidance, the outfit became less a spectacle and more a machine, humming smoothly in the background of Chicago life. At home, Frank lived as he always had, simply, quietly, carefully. His personal life remained shielded from his professional world, a boundary he never allowed to blur. Neighbors saw him as steady, disciplined, perhaps even ordinary, and that was how he wanted it. He knew too well the danger of drawing attention, of living too loudly. Capone had lived loudly, and the world had devoured him for it. Frank chose the opposite path. He did not need the world's applause. He needed its silence. Yet even as he guided the outfit with calm precision, Frank never forgot that danger remained constant. Law enforcement had not forgotten them. Rivals had not disappeared, and ambition still simmered in the shadows. He lived with vigilance, never allowing himself the comfort of complacency. He knew that every empire carried the seeds of its own downfall, and he intended to delay that downfall as long as possible. Chicago, during these years, reflected both the despair of its citizens and the quiet resilience of its underworld. In the daylight, men stood in bread lines, children played in alleys, and newspapers printed stories of political failures. At night, in hidden rooms and hushed gatherings, decisions were made that shaped the flow of money and power across the city. Frank was there at the center, not as a flamboyant king, but as a silent architect. His legacy was not in spectacle, but in survival. By the late 1930s, the outfit stood not only strong, but stronger in some ways than it had been under Capone. It was less visible, less vulnerable, more deeply entrenched in the structures of the city. Frank had proven that an empire could survive without headlines, without noise, without constant fire. He had proven that patience, precision, and silence could build something even more enduring. But Frank also knew that no man could outrun time or fate forever. He carried that awareness with him in every step, every decision. It was what kept him sharp, what kept him alive, what made him the man others respected even if they never fully understood him. The boy who once learned the language of survival in narrow Italian streets had become the man who wrote the language of survival in Chicago. And as the world beyond the city shifted, with war clouds gathering overseas and change stirring at home, Frank prepared himself for whatever storms lay ahead. For in the end, he knew one truth better than most. Power that shouts burns quickly, but power that whispers endures. The late 1930s bled into the 1940s with a tension that stretched across the world. War clouds gathered overseas. Headlines screamed of invasions and battles in places most Chicagoans had never heard of, and the United States stood at the edge of a storm it could not avoid. For the city itself, daily struggles continued, families coping with the depression, businesses scraping by, neighborhoods holding on to hope with thin threads. Beneath all this, the outfit continued its quiet rhythm, its influence woven into corners of the city that few outside truly understood. At the helm of that machine stood Frank Nitti, calm as ever, steady as the river that wound its way through the city's heart. His leadership style had long since proven itself. Where others relied on spectacle, Frank relied on structure. He kept operations smooth, avoided unnecessary risks, and reminded his men constantly that silence was survival. Yet new times brought new pressures. Law enforcement, still stung by the triumph of putting Capone behind bars, remained eager for another victory. Federal attention shifted toward organized crime with renewed determination. The outfit could no longer afford even the smallest misstep, and Frank knew it. He expanded their reach into industries less likely to attract headlines. Labor unions had already become fertile ground, and under Frank's careful eye, their influence grew. Control of union leadership meant control of contracts, and control of contracts meant influence that stretched far beyond speakeasies and gambling dens. Construction, transportation, and even war-related industries quietly found themselves connected to the outfit's invisible hand. These ventures lacked the glamour of Prohibition's liquor trade, but they carried stability, and stability was Frank's greatest pursuit. Within the outfit, however, ambition still stirred. Men who had grown used to the wild profits of Prohibition sometimes grew restless with quieter streams of money. Younger figures, eager to make their mark, wanted bigger risks, flashier ventures. Frank listened patiently, but he rarely indulged recklessness. His message was simple. Loud money drew loud consequences. If they wanted longevity, they had to build carefully, layer by layer, foundation by foundation. Most eventually accepted his wisdom, but whispers of frustration never fully disappeared. At home, Frank lived as he always had, shielded, simple, careful. His life outside the outfit remained ordinary enough to disarm suspicion. He was a man of routine, walking familiar streets, keeping to familiar habits. Neighbors saw him as steady, almost dull, compared to the legends whispered about Capone. That ordinariness was deliberate, a shield stronger than any guard. Frank understood that the safest way to live under constant scrutiny was to appear unremarkable. The war brought new opportunities, but also new dangers. Federal contracts meant enormous sums of money, and the outfit positioned itself to benefit where it could. Supplies, transportation, and labor all passed through channels that could be quietly influenced. Yet the government was also more alert than ever, watching for corruption, hunting for figures who might exploit the national crisis. Frank moved cautiously, ensuring their involvement remained invisible. He reminded his men that the country's eyes were fixed on survival, and any hint of betrayal would draw wrath they could not withstand. One evening, in a quiet meeting room far from downtown, Frank sat with a group of trusted figures. They spoke of opportunities in defense contracts, of men eager to skim profits from the surge of spending. The younger voices in the room grew excited, eager to dive headfirst into ventures that glittered with possibility. Frank sat silently, listening as he always did, letting the wave of enthusiasm crest. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, deliberate, unshakable. He reminded them that the war would end, that the contracts would fade, but that unions and construction would remain long after. His words cooled the room, and though disappointment lingered on some faces, the wisdom was undeniable. In these years, Frank's reputation as the outfit's stabilizer solidified. He was not seen as the most ambitious, nor the most daring, but he was seen as the one who ensured survival. His men might not leave meetings exhilarated, but they left secure, certain that their leader's judgment kept them safe. In a world where recklessness could end empires, that steadiness became priceless. Yet pressure weighed heavily. Federal agents closed in more often, their investigations pressing closer to the outfit's quiet operations. Raids, subpoenas, and interrogations became part of the rhythm of life. Frank endured it all with the same composure he had always carried, but the constant watch wore on him. He lived with vigilance sharper than ever, reading every glance, weighing every word, trusting fewer and fewer. His paranoia, once a useful tool, grew heavier with age. Chicago itself carried on, its streets alive with both ordinary struggles and hidden currents. Children played stickball in alleys, mothers stretched thin budgets to feed families, and workers marched in strikes that often carried invisible strings pulled by men like Frank. Yet to the casual eye, he was simply another man in a hat, walking with steady steps through neighborhoods that never guessed how deeply his hand shaped their daily lives. By the early 1940s, Frank Nitti had guided the outfit through storms that might have destroyed it. Capone's fall, the Depression, government pressure, all had threatened collapse, but under his quiet control, the empire endured. Still, he knew no reign lasted forever. He had watched enough men rise and fall to understand that survival was always temporary. He carried that knowledge in his eyes, a reminder that no matter how carefully one built, time and fate eventually demanded their share. And yet, even as he carried that weight, Frank remained steady. The boy who had once learned survival in Italian alleys had become the man who sustained an empire in Chicago. He had done so without headlines, without flamboyance, without noise. His story was not one of spectacle, but of persistence, of patience, of silence that carried more power than shouts ever could. The war would continue, and with it, new challenges and opportunities would emerge. But whatever storms awaited, Frank Nitti would meet them as he always had, with calm eyes, steady hands, and the unshakable belief that true power did not need to be seen to be felt. The early 1940s carried with them a sense of unease that Frank could never quite shake. He had weathered storms before, the fall of Capone, the fury of law enforcement, the shifting tides of money and opportunity. But something about these years felt different. The city itself was restless, alive with the rhythm of war, with men leaving for the front and factories churning out weapons instead of ordinary goods. Chicago had become a city of production, a city feeding a global conflict. For the outfit, this meant both opportunity and danger, and Frank knew both weighed equally heavy on the scale. For decades, his calm had been his greatest strength. He carried himself with the patience of a man who understood that noise drew attention, and attention brought ruin. But with each passing year, the burden of vigilance grew heavier. He trusted fewer men now. He analyzed every gesture, replayed every conversation, questioned every alliance. Where once his caution had steadied him, now it pressed down like a constant weight. The paranoia that had long kept him alive had begun to erode his peace. Government scrutiny had never gone away, but during the war it sharpened. Investigators knew that organized crime still had its hands in labor unions, contracts, and transportation. The stakes were higher now. Any disruption to wartime production was treated not as a crime, but as sabotage. Federal agents moved with more aggression. Prosecutors pressed harder, and whispers of indictments began to circle. Frank was no longer young, and though his composure never wavered in public, in private he felt the strain. One evening, he sat alone in his study, the dim glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the room. Papers were stacked neatly on his desk, accounts balanced as always, but his eyes lingered not on numbers, but on the silence around him. The quiet that once brought him comfort now felt heavier, filled with echoes of questions he could not answer. How long could he hold the line? How long before the patience that had sustained him gave way under the relentless press of time and law? He leaned back, exhaling slowly, a man still in control yet haunted by the sense that control was slipping, grain by grain, like sand, through fingers. Within the outfit, men still deferred to him, but even they noticed the weight in his eyes. He had guided them through years of uncertainty, but the toll was beginning to show. His instructions remained clear, his discipline unbroken, yet there was a weariness in the way he carried himself. Younger men, eager and ambitious, watched closely. Some respected his endurance, others whispered that his time was nearing its end. Ambition never rested, and Frank knew it. He had once been the young man rising in the shadows, and he understood better than anyone how quickly respect could turn to hunger. Law enforcement pressure reached new peaks. Subpoenas arrived more frequently, agents hovered closer, and rumors swirled of indictments that could shake the outfit to its foundation. Frank attended meetings with lawyers, sat through endless discussions of strategy, and though his face never betrayed him, inside, he felt the growing weight of inevitability. He had seen enough men taken down to know when the tide was turning. At home, the separation between his two worlds grew harder to maintain. His family noticed the strain, the longer silences at dinner, the sleepless nights. Frank offered reassurances, as he always had, but even he could hear the thinness in his own words. He had built his life on discipline, on the ability to divide personal from professional, but the cracks were widening. The pressures of the outside world seeped in, and the walls he had built so carefully trembled. Still, he did not falter in his role. In meetings, his voice remained steady. His instructions were clear, his authority unquestioned. Men who worked under him continued to trust him, even if they whispered of his weariness behind closed doors. He reminded them constantly that survival required patience, that recklessness now would bring destruction faster than ever. They listened because Frank's voice carried the weight of experience, of decades spent balancing on the edge without falling. But in the quiet hours, when he was alone, the doubts grew louder. He thought often of Capone, of how loudly he had lived, how fiercely he had burned, and how quickly it had all collapsed. Frank had taken the opposite path, whispering where Capone had shouted, enduring where Capone had fallen. And yet here he was, feeling the same inevitability pressing in. Perhaps it was not about the style of leadership at all. Perhaps the life itself carried only one true end. Chicago continued to move around him, a city alive with both wartime industry and its own timeless shadows. Workers filled factories, soldiers shipped off to battlefields, and in the hidden corners where deals were made, Frank's influence still held. But he could not ignore the growing sense that his grip was slipping, not because he had grown careless, but because time itself was relentless. He walked the streets of his neighborhood still with the same steady pace, his hat tilted low, his coat pulled against the wind. Neighbors saw him as they always had, quiet, disciplined, ordinary in appearance. But behind the calm exterior, he carried a heaviness that only he could feel. He thought often of the boy he once was, arriving in America with his family, wide-eyed and curious. That boy could never have imagined this life, this power, this weight. By the mid-1940s, whispers of indictments solidified into reality. Federal prosecutors prepared cases that threatened not just Frank but the outfit itself. He attended hearings, met with attorneys, weighed strategies, but deep down he sensed that the walls were closing too tightly to escape. He had built an empire of silence, but silence could not shield him forever. He had lived long enough to know that no man in their world could outrun consequence indefinitely. And so Frank carried on, calm as always in public, but inwardly bracing for storms he knew might finally be too strong to endure. The man who had built his life on steadiness now faced the greatest test of all, whether his composure could withstand the crushing weight of inevitability. The winter air in Chicago felt heavier than usual in the early 1940s. The city buzzed with wartime urgency, factories working through the night, workers trudging through snow to punch clocks, headlines filled with distant battles. Yet beneath the patriotic energy, another story unfolded quietly in the shadows. Federal prosecutors had turned their gaze firmly toward the outfit, and at the heart of their cases stood the man who had once lived best in silence. Frank Nitti, Long, the calm center of chaos, found himself standing in a storm that even his patience could not ease. The indictments were not rumors anymore. They came with the full force of the government, stacks of papers filled with names, dates, accusations, and promises of years behind bars. Frank had always known this day might come. He had watched enough men fall to understand that the law was patient. But knowing it in theory and facing it in reality were different things. For the first time in years, he felt the walls pressing in on him with a weight that no amount of calculation could push back. In public, he carried himself as always, hat low, step steady, voice calm. He sat at meetings, gave instructions, reassured younger men who looked to him for direction. They saw in him the same unshakable figure they always had. Yet in private, the weight of the indictments pressed down harder each night. Sleep came less often. Thoughts churned constantly, circling around possibilities, escape routes, outcomes. His discipline remained, but it was strained, the cracks showing in quiet moments when no one was there to see. The outfit itself carried on. Money still flowed. Unions still bent under invisible strings. Gambling houses still buzzed with life. But beneath the surface, tension spread. Ambitious men whispered, wondering if the indictments meant change, if Frank's hold was slipping. Some saw opportunity, others saw danger. Frank knew both were true. He understood better than anyone that power in their world was never static. It shifted like the river, cutting new channels, erasing old paths. He had once been the young man watching older figures fade. Now he was the one others watched with calculating eyes. At home, the strain became harder to hide. He ate less, spoke less, and carried himself with a heaviness his family could not ignore. He offered reassurances, as he always had, but the words rang hollow, even to his own ears. He had lived so long balancing two worlds, ordinary man to neighbors, architect of power to the outfit, that keeping them separate now felt impossible. The law had blurred the lines, dragging both worlds into its grasp. One evening, he sat alone in his study, the lamp casting its familiar glow, papers neatly stacked as always. He stared at the documents before him, legal notices, letters from attorneys, lists of charges. Each word felt like a stone, each page another weight. He had built his life on silence, on patience, on control. But the law was louder now, relentless, immune to his strategies. For the first time, he questioned whether his approach, quiet endurance, whispered power, had merely delayed the inevitable rather than prevented it. Meetings with his closest men grew more tense. They asked what the plan was, how they would weather this storm. Frank listened, as he always had, letting their worries spill out before speaking. His answers were measured, but the men sensed the weariness in them. He still held their respect, but respect was not the same as certainty. They wanted assurance, and though Frank gave it, his eyes betrayed doubt. Some of them saw it, and in seeing it, began to wonder if the future belonged elsewhere. The indictments loomed larger each day, trials promised, prison sentences threatened. Frank had faced danger his entire life, but this felt different. Gunfire could be avoided, rivalries managed, but the law was slower, more methodical, more suffocating. It didn't strike in a burst of violence. It tightened gradually like a noose. He could feel it closing, and the weight of it pressed deeper into his chest with every passing day. The city itself seemed to mirror his mood. Winter dragged on. Gray skies hung low, and even the laughter spilling from taverns felt muted. Chicago had always been a city of contrasts, bright lights and dark alleys, music and silence, hope and despair. Frank had lived in those contrasts his whole life, had thrived in them. But now, even the city felt heavy, as if its rhythm had slowed in sympathy with his own. He thought often of his journey, of the boy who had arrived from Italy with nothing but curiosity and grit, of the young man who had studied the language of silence on Chicago's streets, of the trusted lieutenant who had stood at Capone's side, of the leader who had guided the outfit through storms. He had lived a life few could imagine, had built an empire without ever shouting his name. And yet here he was, feeling the same inevitability as so many before him. By early 1943, the indictments had become reality. Federal prosecutors prepared to drag him into court. The papers buzzed with his name, and the walls seemed to close tighter with every sunrise. He carried himself with composure still, but inside, the weight was nearly unbearable. His paranoia, once a sharp tool, had grown into a constant voice, whispering of betrayal, of failure, of endings. The man who had once steadied others with his calm now struggled to steady himself. He walked the street still, his hat low, his steps measured, but each walk felt heavier, as though the city itself pressed against him. He had lived his life by whispering where others shouted, by enduring where others fell, but now he wondered if even silence had its limits. Spring crept into Chicago with hesitant warmth, the kind that lingered only for an hour before the chill returned. The snow melted into slush, the streets slick with a grayness that seemed to match the mood of the city. War headlines dominated newspapers, soldiers boarded trains, and factories roared with the sound of production. Yet in the shadows, another story was nearing its end. Frank Nitti, long the quiet backbone of the outfit, stood at the edge of a weight he could no longer carry. The indictments were not threats anymore. They were realities waiting for signatures, dates marked on calendars, hearings scheduled with certainty. Federal prosecutors spoke confidently in the press, describing the cases they had built, the sentences they expected. For Frank, the words were not just newsprint. They were chains already tightening around his wrists. He read them each morning with the same quiet discipline, but every line pressed harder than the last. He had always prided himself on patience, but patience could not stop the slow march of the law. Meetings grew tense in those weeks. His men gathered in familiar back rooms, the air heavy with smoke and unease. They asked him how the outfit would survive, how they would endure without his guidance if the law succeeded. Frank listened, gave answers that carried the weight of experience, but even his calm voice could not erase the tension from their eyes. They respected him still, but fear had crept in. Fear not of rivals or raids, but of the inevitability of the courtroom. Fear that no amount of silence or strategy could shield them this time. At night, Frank lay awake longer than ever before. The stillness that had once been his comfort now felt oppressive. He replayed his life in fragments, the boy stepping onto American soil, the young man watching street corners for unspoken rules, the trusted lieutenant at Capone's side, the leader who steadied the outfit through storms. He had lived his life by whispering where others shouted, by enduring where others crumbled. But now, in the quiet hours, he wondered if it had all been leading here, to an ending that no discipline could prevent. His health, already strained by years of pressure, began to falter. The weight of sleepless nights, the constant paranoia, the endless burden of leadership pressed into his chest with every breath. He walked slower through the neighborhood now, though he kept his posture steady, his hat low, his steps deliberate. Neighbors still saw him as the quiet man they had always known, but those closest could sense the heaviness beneath his composure. The outfit carried on, as it always had. Money flowed, deals were struck, unions swayed. But beneath the surface, men whispered of succession. Ambition stirred among younger figures, men who saw opportunity in the shadows of Frank's weariness. He knew it, of course. He had been that younger man once, watching older leaders fade. He could not fault them for seeing the future in themselves, but the realization stung nonetheless. Time, he knew, came for everyone, even for those who built their lives on silence. One March morning in 1943, Frank walked the familiar streets with a heaviness that seemed to cling to his coat. The chill air bit at his face, the city alive with the sounds of wartime industry, but he felt distant from it all. His thoughts circled endlessly: indictments, trials, prison, legacy. He had built an empire of quiet endurance, But what would be remembered? The boy who dreamed of power? The lieutenant who stood in Capone's shadow? The leader who guided the outfit through the depression? Or the weary man cornered by papers and prosecutors? He returned home that day and sat at his desk, the lamp casting its glow across stacks of documents. He stared at them for a long while, the neat handwriting of lawyers, the cold precision of government notices. Each line felt final, each word a reminder that his story was approaching its close. He thought of his family, of the men who had stood by him, of the countless decisions that had shaped not just his life, but the lives of thousands who never knew his name. Frank had always believed that true power did not shout, it whispered. But now, in the silence of his study, he realized that whispers could fade into nothing, drowned out by the relentless march of time and consequence. He had outlasted rivals, outmaneuvered threats, and endured storms. But this storm was different. This was not a rival he could outthink, not a bullet he could avoid. This was inevitability itself. And so Frank sat, calm as always, but with a finality in his eyes. The man who had built his life on patience had reached a moment where patience no longer offered escape. He knew his story was ending, not with spectacle, not with shouts, but with the same quietness that had defined him. The city outside carried on unaware, its factories roaring, its trains rumbling, its children laughing in alleys. But within the silence of one room, the life of Frank Nitti, the enforcer who had led by whispers, was nearing its close. He rose from his chair slowly, walked through his home with measured steps, and paused at the doorway, looking out at a city he had shaped more than it would ever admit. His face was calm, his eyes steady, the same as they had been in countless meetings, countless storms. Yet this calm carried a different weight now, the weight of acceptance. For Frank Nitti, the end was not about noise or spectacle. It was about silence. The morning sun broke weakly across Chicago, casting long shadows that stretched between buildings still damp from the thawing snow. It was the kind of morning where the air carried a bite, where the city seemed to hold its breath before coming fully alive. On that day in March of 1943, Frank Nitti rose early, his movements deliberate, his composure unchanged to anyone watching. He had always been a man of routine, and even now at the edge of his story, he carried himself with the same measured steadiness that had defined his life. The indictments loomed over him like storm clouds. He had read them, studied them, turned them over in his mind until the words blurred. The prosecutors had built their case with precision, targeting not just men in the shadows, but him directly. For Frank, prison was not just confinement. It was something far heavier. He had lived his life walking carefully between worlds, managing appearances for neighbors while commanding respect in back rooms. A prison cell would collapse both worlds into one, stripping away the very balance that had allowed him to endure. He left his home that morning dressed neatly as always, his hat resting at its familiar angle, his coat buttoned against the chill. To anyone who saw him, he looked like the same quiet man they had passed countless times on the streets. Few would have guessed the storm that raged silently within him. He walked with purpose, though each step carried the weight of finality. By mid-morning, he found himself outside the tracks near Riverside, the sky pale above him, the city's sounds muted by distance. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet Frank had always understood better than most. For him, silence had never been emptiness. It had been language, strength, the very foundation of his power. And now, in this final moment, silence wrapped around him once more. Reports would later describe what happened next in blunt terms, but those who knew him understood it as something more complex. For Frank, the decision was not about fear, but about control. He had built his life on control, controlling his voice, his presence, his decisions, his empire. Prison would have stripped him of that. To live confined, waiting on others' schedules reduced to a number, would have been the final betrayal of everything he had built. He chose instead to leave the way he had lived, on his own terms, in silence. News spread quickly across Chicago. Newspapers ran with bold headlines recounting the sudden end of the man they had long called the enforcer. The public read with fascination, adding his name to the long list of legends born from the city's underworld. But inside the outfit, the response was quieter, more measured. Men who had worked beside him for years gathered in small rooms, speaking his name in low tones, reflecting on the steadiness he had given them. They knew that without Frank's calm hand, the future would be uncertain. Ambition would rise, rivalries would flare, and the balance he had so carefully maintained might fracture. His funeral drew both family and figures from the world he had guided. They came dressed in black, their faces composed, their silence heavy with meaning. Some wept quietly, others simply bowed their heads, but all knew they were witnessing the end of an era. Frank had not been the loudest, nor the most flamboyant, but he had been the spine that held the outfit together after Capone's fall. His absence left a void that no amount of noise could easily fill. For his family, grief mingled with relief. They mourned the man they loved, but they also understood that his burden had finally ended. The dual life he had carried, ordinary neighbor to some, shadowed leader to others, had demanded more than anyone could see. They remembered him not as the enforcer or the leader, but as the quiet man who provided, who shielded them from storms, who carried himself with discipline even in his final days. Chicago itself seemed to carry on unchanged. The trains still rumbled through the city. Factories still poured smoke into the sky. Children still played stickball in alleys. Yet for those who knew the city's hidden rhythms, something had shifted. The silence that Frank had embodied, the steady presence that had kept the outfit's gears turning, was gone. The machine would continue, but without his hand guiding it, the future would be more uncertain, more volatile. Writers and reporters would later tell his story in fragments, shaping his life into headlines, weaving myth and fact together until it became difficult to separate one from the other. Some painted him as ruthless, others as disciplined, others still as tragic. The truth, as always, lived somewhere between. He had been a boy from Italy who learned the language of survival in Chicago's alleys. He had been a lieutenant, a leader, a man of whispers who carried power without spectacle. And in the end, he had been a man who chose silence one final time, rather than surrender control to the inevitability of prison walls. In the years that followed, the outfit would evolve, new names would rise, new stories would be told. But Frank's name lingered in their history, a reminder of the power of steadiness, the strength of silence, the inevitability of consequence. His story was not one of wild headlines, but of endurance, of a man who survived longer than most in a world that consumed men quickly. And though his ending came quietly, it was an ending consistent with the life he had lived. The city remembered him in its own way, not with statues or songs, but with whispers. In taverns, in back rooms, in the quiet exchanges of men who understood what it meant to walk between worlds, his name was spoken softly, with a mixture of respect and sadness. Frank Nitti had not been a man of spectacle, but he had been a man of weight. And long after his final day, that weight lingered in the air of Chicago, woven into its history, its myths, its shadows. Time moved forward, as it always does, and the city of Chicago carried on with its endless rhythm. The trains still thundered past the river, the factories roared through the war years, and soldiers returned to parades in streets lined with flags and music. Life never stopped for one man, not even for a figure whose shadow had stretched so quietly, but so firmly, across the city. Frank Nitti's passing became another headline in the newspapers, another story added to Chicago's long history of men who had shaped its underworld. But to those who knew him, to those who had lived under his steady hand, his absence was more than newsprint. It was a turning point. The outfit did not collapse after Frank's death. It adjusted as it always had, shifting power into the hands of new leaders, finding new ways to weave influence into the city's industries. But something essential had changed. Frank had been a stabilizer, a figure who valued patience over ambition, silence over spectacle. Without him, ambition rose more quickly, rivalries sharpened faster, and the quiet discipline he had embodied grew harder to find. The machine kept moving, but the steady rhythm faltered, and those who remembered his leadership often looked back with respect for the balance he had maintained. In the years that followed, his story was told in many ways. To law enforcement, he was another crime boss, proof of the endless struggle against organized networks. To the public, he was a name tied to Capone, often reduced to a side note in the larger, louder story of Chicago's underworld. But to those inside the outfit, and to those who studied its history, Frank Nitti stood out as something different. He was the man who had carried an empire not by shouting but by whispering, not by demanding fear, but by embodying steadiness. His legacy was not in dramatic headlines but in survival, in the years he gave the outfit when it might otherwise have fractured. Writers would call him the Enforcer, a title that clung to him long after his death. Yet those who truly understood knew he was more than that. He was not just the man who ensured orders were carried out. He was the quiet architect who held the empire together after Capone, who guided it through the Depression and into a new era. He was the man who proved that power did not need to be loud to be real, that silence could shape destinies as surely as any roar. Decades passed, and the world changed. The speakeasies of Prohibition became stories told in books and films, their glamour often exaggerated, their darkness softened for audiences hungry for drama. Capone's name lived on in legend, his larger-than-life persona immortalized in stories that grew taller with each retelling. Frank Nitti's name remained quieter, less flashy, often mentioned second. Yet for those who looked deeper, for those who sought truth beyond spectacle, Nitti's story carried something Capone's never could, a lesson in endurance. Chicago itself bore the traces of his life in ways invisible to most. The labor unions that shaped the city's industries, the construction projects that built its skyline, the hidden currents of influence that flowed beneath legitimate business, all had been touched in some way by the quiet presence of Frank Nitti. His fingerprints lingered not on monuments or public records, but in the unseen structures that shaped the daily lives of thousands. For his family, his legacy was even more complex. They remembered not the enforcer or the leader, but the man who provided, who walked the streets with calm steps, who lived two lives with discipline until the very end. They mourned him not as a figure of history, but as the quiet anchor of their lives, a man whose burdens they could only ever glimpse from afar. For them, the myths and headlines meant little. What mattered was the man himself, the father, the husband, the provider who carried the weight of two worlds until it became too heavy to bear. In Chicago's neighborhoods, whispers of his name lingered for years. Older men told stories of the quiet figure who once walked past them with steady steps, who never raised his voice but always commanded respect.